All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome officially to Tuesday. How we doing today? All right. Okay. Avi, you look just a little tired. Did you stay up late last night? Oh. I was listening to a fascinating podcast. This is a couple months ago on sleep. And apparently when you sleep, all the things that kind of happen in your brain is what allows you to kind of organize your memories and sort of commit them to long-term memory. And so it was really interesting. The scientist was talking about when we kind of go through our day, we kind of we encounter information, and then we kind of make like almost a subconscious decision about whether we need to remember it or not, right? So, for instance, if you drove downtown in your car, I know you don't have a car, but if you drove downtown in your car and you parked it, and then you went shopping or whatever, you'd have to remember where you parked your car, right? So you would kind of tag that memory as kind of like a temporary memory, right? You want to remember where you parked your car, but you don't want to remember where you parked your car for the rest of your life, right? Like it's not an important thing. And so we kind of go through these during our day about, okay, this I have to remember, this I only have to remember for today, but then I don't need it anymore. And when you sleep, that's where all those memories kind of get filed in the right place. And so the ones that are temporary, that you don't need to remember, get forgotten. And the ones that you do want to remember for long term, those get kind of filed away differently. And so interestingly, we're kind of constantly tagging our experiences about, do I need to remember this forever, or do I need to just remember this for the next few hours? And so when you sleep, that's where all those memories get organized. But when you don't sleep, or when any of us don't sleep, that process doesn't really happen, right? And so for those of us who maybe want to do well in school and perform well, your sleep is essential, right? Because you do all that learning during the day, hopefully, and then when you sleep at night, that's where all those memories start to get kind of filed away in your long-term memory. And if you're short of sleep, like if you don't sleep the night before enough, it actually inhibits your ability to build those memories in the first place. So if you're chronically sleep deprived, if you're not getting enough sleep ever, your brain can't really do what it needs to while it's sleeping, and then the next day you're kind of tired and your brain's not working right, and it makes it more difficult for you to form those memories to begin with. So the most important thing, not the most important, but a critical thing to do is actually get enough sleep so that those memories can kind of be organized properly and so that you can actually build them in the first place. But if you're constantly missing sleep, your brain can't really do what it's supposed to do, and it's harder to remember what you need, and it's harder to learn what you need to learn. Anyway, it's a very interesting podcast. Sorry, I thought of it. But we've all done it, right? We've all stayed up a little too late, or maybe we just woke up in the middle of the night for no reason and couldn't get back to sleep, and it happens, right? Not to Regina, though. Or does it? Every day? Oh no. Oh no. Okay. Let's get started. So, after that long rambling tangent, back to the Cold War, right? So, again, this Cold War kind of defines, actually I was listening to another podcast yesterday, which is very interesting, but maybe I'll tell you about it later. We get to the Cold War, and so the World War is over, but this other kind of conflict is just unfolding, right? Between a communist Soviet Union and a capitalist democratic United States, right? And so the lines are going to be, the lines are going to be drawn in various places in the world because, again, we're looking at this is a bipolar world, right? And not like bipolar like that, but there are two poles, there are two powers, right? And so as the kind of decades go on in the 20th century, everyone's going to have to kind of choose a side, right? Whose side are you on? The Soviets or the Americans, right? And definitely at this point in history, and particularly with Europe, a lot of countries are either trying to figure out what side they're on, or maybe they're already just stuck with the side they're on, right? And again, you can see there's a few countries here that are going to try to stay out of it, right? Finland and Sweden are staying out of the Cold War, right? They're like, we're not getting involved in this, leave us alone, right? Which actually makes it much more interesting that these two countries are now actively supporting Ukraine against Russia. So it's very interesting that even during the Cold War, Finland and Sweden stayed out of it, but now they're actively supporting Ukraine in their fight against Russia. But anyway, so everybody's kind of trying to figure out what side they're on, right? We said yesterday that this comes out of World War II because we have these two superpowers that are quite different politically and economically, and neither one of them trusts one another, right? They're both kind of looking at each other through squinty eyes and wondering what the other one is planning, right? And we also said that this kind of, the structure of Europe is based on who liberated what countries, right? So the Western powers came from this way and sort of pushed the Nazis back into Germany. The Soviets came from this way and pushed the Nazis back into Germany. And then they kind of met halfway through at the Elbe River, as it turns out. And again, because these two sides couldn't really cooperate and didn't really have common goals, we wound up with a divided Europe, right? Contrary to the Treaty of Versailles, when they redrew the European map kind of by common agreement, except for Germany, who got left out. But they redrew the map by common agreement. But here, there wasn't common agreement, and it winds up basically split right down the middle, right? Whoops. Oh, no. There we go. Yeah. So Germany, of course, gets split. We have the same thing happening as with the Treaty of Versailles. Some people wanted a politically and economically weak Germany. Some people said, guys, that didn't really work out very well for us last time. Maybe we need a politically and economically strong Germany, right? And again, they can't agree, and so they split it in half. And so both sides kind of get their way. The eastern side of Germany is politically and economically weak, and the western side is politically and economically strong. We said that at this early stage of the Cold War, the two sides are kind of poking at each other, right? They're kind of testing the boundaries, right? What can they get away with? Just like a little kid, right? What can I get away with until mom or dad tells me no, right? And so the Soviets here, they stay in Iran after they're supposed to have left, hoping or kind of waiting to see if the U.S. will do anything. The U.S. does do something. They push back, right? They say, hey, there's an agreement. You're supposed to get out. You should get out, right? And so diplomatic pressure forces the Soviets to leave, right? Around this time, Truman announces what's called the Truman Doctrine, right? The idea that the United States is going to intervene. It's going to support free peoples who are, what does it say? Do I have it here? Support free peoples who are resisting subjugation, right? So being kind of overpowered by armed minorities or by outside pressures, right? We said this was a huge deal for the United States, right? The United States was an isolationist country before this. They weren't really interested in European problems or other people's problems. They were busy living the American dream. But now they're going to step forward, right, as kind of the barrier against communism. And this is a big deal, right? Because again, A, it represents a 180-degree turn for the Americans. But B, what kind of world do you think we would be living in if the Americans didn't do this? If the Americans said, you know what, whatever, this is not our problem. If the Soviets want to take over all of Europe, let Europe deal with it. It's not our deal, right? And again, that's possible, right? Because, sorry, Avi, I'm not picking on you here, but Avi mentioned that last week, right? If it's not on our continent, maybe it's not our problem, right? And the Americans could have thought that way, right? And in fact, before this point, they did think that way. But I wonder what kind of events would have happened in the second half of the 20th century if the Americans said, you know what, all that communism stuff, that's not our problem, right? We're democratic, we're capitalist, we're gonna do our thing over here. Let Europe deal with Europe, right? They could have said that, right? And so it would have been a very different world and a very different history, I think, if they did. But again, here we see kind of the beginning of that turnaround, right? We also see that the U.S. is increasingly going to go to the defense or go to the support of Western Europe, right? And the first way they start to do it is with economic aid, right? Fortunately, the U.S. is a rich country. They start pumping money into European countries to help their economies, right? And what was the rationale behind that? Why did they start spending all that money in Western Europe? Talked about it yesterday. To prevent what? Yes, to prevent the spread of communism. How does all that money do that?
Usually, because communism looks attractive in the eyes of the people, if the country is like a chaos or like an economy.
Yeah. Yeah.
By U.S. spending a lot of money helping the recover economically, it helps make communism look less attractive.
Yeah.
Because they're not really in a
Yeah. Yeah, right? So to people whose economies have collapsed and there's, wide-ranging unemployment and everybody's miserable, the idea that everybody might have a job and might have, what they need provided to them, that sounds great, right? Communism sounds great from that perspective. But for countries that are a little bit richer and have higher employment, communism doesn't look good, right? If you go and ask 100 Canadians on the street, hey, do you want to switch to communism? I'm fairly certain you'll get 100 people saying, I don't think so, right? So again, the US sees that the best way to kind of combat the spread of communism is to raise people's quality of life, right? Get the economies moving again, get people back to work, and then they actually communism just won't look good. They won't switch because they won't really be tempted to, right? And of course, again, this is helpful for the US too, because they'll get trading partners and they'll get to make even more money. So, there's a little bit of selfishness in there, a little bit of self-interest, but really they're trying to contain communism, right? And again, that's the US policy here, is to contain the spread of communism. We said at one point Stalin wants to get rid of the Western powers from Berlin, right? They're right inside his sphere of influence. They're all up in his grill. Doesn't really like that. He's trying to get rid of them. I know that's an old saying, but he's trying to get rid of them. And so he basically cuts off road and rail service to Berlin, right? And says, okay, your people are going to starve unless you get out, right? And what do the Allies do? Well, they say, actually, we're going to continue to supply these people, right? And they do for nearly an entire year, right? Everything Berlin needs, food, clothing, fuel, medicine, all that stuff gets sent in by plane, right? Allied or Western planes are landing in Berlin every 4 minutes or something like that, right? And so for an entire year. And so again, you can see that the U.S. is taking kind of extraordinary efforts to contain communism, right? And to make sure that Stalin isn't really going to get away with anything, right? You've heard of that. Have you heard of that expression? If you give someone an inch, they'll take a mile, kind of thing. I think that's what the U.S. is worried about. If they give Stalin even a little bit, he'll push and he'll take more, right? And so they're really not letting him get away with anything. They're not letting him push them around or bully them, right? Yesterday we read a section of the textbook as well, and we learned about NATO, right? So again, this is a very, nobody cared about NATO for the last 20 years, and now all of a sudden it's all anyone cares about. But it starts out with the Treaty of Brussels in 1948, right? So a couple of smaller countries, you can see Iceland and Belgium, France, who else is in there? Luxembourg, Netherlands, Great Britain. They're a little concerned about Soviet aggression. They're a little concerned that Stalin will try to, attack or take over parts of Europe. And so they ally themselves in sort of a defensive alliance, right? And again, a little bit later, in about a year, Canada will join, but most notably the United States will join, right? And that's what really gives the military weight to NATO, right? And so now Stalin knows that not only these countries are all going to stand together, but of course one of them has an atomic bomb, right? And so if he decides to attack Denmark, for instance, Denmark's, big tough friend with a nuclear weapon is going to come and defend them, right? So it's a very strong kind of military barrier, right? So the U.S. is kind of making an economic investment in Western Europe, but they're also making a military investment as well, right? And speaking of military investments, speaking of military investments, we talked about that NSC 68 policy, right? And so the idea there was that, yes, the Americans were going to build up their military to significantly large levels, right? And that they were going to keep pressure on the Soviets, right? They figured that if they presented a strong front to the Soviets and backed it up with military power, that the Soviets would back down, right? All they had to do was just sort of keep the pressure on and keep them from spreading, right? And so they kind of adopted this policy that was written, and the U.S. kind of becomes this global policeman that we, are more familiar with, right? So again, after World War II, the U.S. is a different kind of country, right? A different kind of country than they were before World War II. We also said, I see that I have a typo in my slides there, so that's kind of embarrassing. Strengthened American involvement. It's not a word. Embarrassing. I'm blushing under the mask. We also read yesterday that NATO will kind of motivate Stalin to kind of do the same thing, right? So he'll get all of those Eastern Bloc countries in an alliance with him, calling it the Warsaw Pact. And again, any attack on a Warsaw Pact country is an attack on the Soviet Union. Again, it kind of feels a little similar to before World War I, right? When all those countries were allying with each other. In this case, the alliances are a little more public, right? So everybody knows who's allied with who, which is helpful. Now, I'm throwing this in. I didn't ask you a question about this, I don't think. There was a lot of detail in the textbook about names and what happened in Czechoslovakia. But basically what happens here is that they have an election, and the election kind of returns half and half, right? So some of the people that get into power are communists. Some of the people who get into power are Democrats, okay? And so there's kind of the government of Czechoslovakia is kind of half and half. And what will happen is the communists, or Stalin actually, will say, this isn't really satisfactory. I want all communists. And so he will have the Democrats removed, right? So I think one of them gets arrested on some kind of charge. One of them commits suicide, wink, 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 right? And they are replaced with hardcore communists, right? So even though democracy almost has a chance in Czechoslovakia, as soon as it does, Stalin comes down hard, gets rid of the Democrats, and installs a communist government, right? So again, it becomes pretty clear that Stalin is not going to allow any kind of independence in Eastern Europe, and any kind of flicker of democracy is going to be squished, right? We read a little bit about Tito, right, who again is kind of a badass, manages to stay out of Stalin's clutches, if you will, simply by having a little distance between him and the Soviet Union, but also by having popular support, right? Again, the people kind of like Tito. They look up to him. He's a war hero. He helped to expel the Nazis. And he's a communist dictator, but he seems to be doing a good job running his country, right? And so Stalin kind of has trouble controlling him. He tries. Tito kind of tells him to jump in the lake, kind of thing. And Stalin eventually has to give up on Yugoslavia, right? And so Stalin will have control over most of those Eastern European countries, but Yugoslavia will kind of get to do its own thing, mostly because of Tito, right? And I said, once Tito dies, I think in is it the 60s? Yugoslavia starts to slip a little bit and fracture. He's kind of the one holding Yugoslavia together, and it's going to come apart a little bit later on. Did you want to add to that, Regina, or are you okay? Are you okay? Okay. Let's see. Okay, NSC 68 we talked about, and finally the Korean War, right? And so here's where things get real, okay, as they say, because from about 1945 to 1950, it's kind of a tentative period, right? The two sides are kind of poking at each other, right? Seeing what the other side will do. There's the Berlin blockade. There's things like that. For most of that time, the U.S. is the only one with nuclear weapons, right? And so even though the Soviet Union might, try to get away with things, the U.S. always has the bomb, right? They've always got, as they say, they've always got the hammer, right? If the Soviet Union gets out of hand, bang, right? But in 1949, the Soviets successfully test their own nuclear weapon, right? And so the balance is kind of, I don't know if it's restored, but now there's a balance, right? Both sides have this terrible, awful weapon, right? And so it's kind of a different story. And again, in 1950, things get real, right? Because we have these two sides that are opposing each other, and they're next door to each other in Europe, but they're also next door to each other in Korea. What's the story with Korea and the Korean War? How does it all start? How does it all start? Do you remember from yesterday, or do you know from your previous studies? What's the deal with Korea?
They tried to change the economy.
Right. So start me off right at the end of World War II. What's the sort of state of Korea? Don't know. Okay, I'll answer that, and then you can do the rest. So, at the end of the World War, Korea is divided at the 38th parallel, right? And so the Allies will liberate southern Korea from the Japanese, but the Soviets will actually come in from the north, and they'll liberate the north half, right? Even though at that point in the war, the Americans said, okay, Soviets, we've got the bomb, we don't need you anymore. Stand down, right? Stop. But the Soviets still moved into the north section of Korea. They liberated it, and so it's kind of divided, right, between sort of a communist regime in in the north and sort of a democratic regime in the south, right? And at the time, nobody really thought this was going to be a big deal, right? And it wasn't a big deal until... Okay, now you take over. Until...
The Americans.
No. Well, the Americans are already there, but who starts this whole thing? His name starts with a K. And his son is currently the leader of North Korea. Huh? That's the son, right?
That.
The dad. Yeah. Kim Il-sung is the dad. Right?
Alright.
Yeah. Kim Il-sung is the dad, right? And Kim Il-sung convinces the Soviets, he says, hey, if you can back me on this, I think I can go into South Korea and I can take all of it. I can take all of Korea. It'll be a communist state. The South Koreans will welcome us. They will throw flowers as we drive down their streets. We will take all of Korea, right? And the West won't bother with us because they don't care about Korea anyway, right? So he kind of convinces the Soviets to back him, right, to give him equipment, and he's going to roll in and take all of Korea. But of course, that's not really going to happen, is it? Does the West care about South Korea?
Yes.
As it turns out, they do, right? Because what did the Truman Doctrine say?
All nations with
Yeah. Hey, Kenny. Yeah, the Truman Doctrine said that the U.S. was going to support free peoples against outside pressures, right? And again, Truman was probably thinking more of Europe, right? And he was probably thinking more of Stalin. But here, it's like, oh, crap. Now, here we have free people in South Korea that are about to be taken over by an outside force, a communist force, right? So again, even though the US probably wasn't planning on defending South Korea, they were probably thinking about West Germany, now they've got this issue, right? And they can't very well go back on what they said, right? Truman made this big declaration that they were going to support people. He can't very well turn around and say, oh, well, not those people. I meant the other people, right? So they're kind of stuck, right? They have to go in and defend these people against this communist incursion, right? Again, as it turns out, the South Koreans don't really want communism, right? They don't welcome Kim Il-sung with open arms. So let me just see where we are here. I just want to see what the text actually said. Did it actually end? Okay. We won't talk about the end of the Korean War just yet. So, let me just see where we are. Yes, that's where we are. So, I would like to show you some documentary footage showing you some of the things that we've already talked about and some additional things. I may stop the film here and there just to ask you questions or to get your reaction to something. I'm just going to check here because for people who are online, the documentary film itself is in Microsoft Teams under Files and then under Videos. And we've watched a little bit of it already, and so we'll be watching from 11 minutes and 38 seconds to we're going to watch to 51:03. So there's kind of lots to see here. And again, it'll give us some context to the things we've already talked about. There'll be some new information as well. I'd also like you to pay attention while we're watching. I'd like you to pay attention to the audience, okay? So who is the audience for this documentary? Who are they talking to, okay? Yeah, is that okay? Can we do that? Okay. let's do it. I'm just gonna close a couple of blinds here. I don't know if we have to do them all, but it's very bright and beautiful outside. But my projector is only so powerful. Okay, let's have a look. Online people, again, watch from 11:38 to 51:03. Then we'll take a break and come back and see what we've seen, okay? Okay. In Microsoft Teams, that's where the video is. So as you can see, things are getting kind of really scary throughout the 1950s, right? Once the Soviet Union has some successes, right, we see that they're able to maintain control of North Korea, and we got a little backstory on where North Korea comes from. Once China turns communist with Mao Zedong's successful revolution, once the Soviets actually get an atomic bomb for themselves, again, the Americans are kind of scared, right? Before they had the hammer, as you say, right? They knew that if the Soviets tried anything too crazy, bang, right? Atomic bomb. But now they don't have the hammer anymore, right? Things are more equal, and it looks like the Soviets are kind of, getting a little bit of the edge, right? They're actually maybe winning the Cold War. People in the US get kind of scared. There are some people who are willing to kind of use this fear to increase their own position, and Senator Joseph McCarthy is one of those, right? He ran around accusing everybody and their dog of being a communist, right? Just to get himself in the news and give himself more power. Of course, eventually he's found out, right? Eventually it comes that he has no proof of anything that he's saying, and people kind of realize that he's all talk, right? But still people are apprehensive and concerned. There's a lot of fear, right? A fear of communism, a fear of being conquered, and a fear of nuclear weapons, because as this period goes on, those two sides are going to create more and more and more of these incredibly dangerous weapons, right? And people are rightly concerned or frightened about this, right? As kind of this Cold War starts to get a little bit out of hand, right? And the fear and the kind of the things that are said and the weapons that are created get just a little bit out of control, right? And it's a frightening, dangerous time. Maybe tomorrow we'll have time to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that's a point where things will get really dangerous, and it's probably the closest we've ever come to an actual nuclear conflict, a conflict in which nuclear weapons are actually used, right? And hopefully we're not coming to that again, but we'll talk about that tomorrow. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about Ukraine tomorrow. But until then, we're out of time here, so I'm going to sign off. Have a nice afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow, okay?